Hello everyone, welcome to my channel about writing stuff. My name's Camille and today we're going to do the last world building video for a while. Next week I'm going to start jumping into characters. What I had originally planned for this video was to actually do a 45-minute long lecture style video of actually walking you guys through the process of how I build a world. I had a mock world all drawn up, I had a bunch of notes, but as I attempted to start filming, the whole process was just very rudimentary and very boring because what I had essentially done was just built the skeleton of a world. And for me, it isn't the big ideas that bring my world to life. It is the small, tiny details and actually digging into things, adding depth to stuff. It's not the big umbrella sort of ideas. It is actually adding depth to a few of these big ideas. So instead, what we're going to talk about today is just that, the small details. A lot of authors refer to this sort of thing as the iceberg effect. You know, you have your 10% up on the surface of the water. That's what you literally show your reader in the book. But then you give the illusion that there's this full iceberg down beneath the surface of the story. I don't really like to use this analogy because it's a little too general in a world where I'm seeking specificity. So instead, the way I like to think of it is the walls of your world. And I'm going to use a gaming analogy, even though I'm not a gamer, but my husband's a gamer. And I remember he was showing me, he was playing Destiny, and he was showing me the lighthouse. And I remember that there was a small little bunker at the bottom with like a cot and a table and a trunk. And I saw the trunk and I got really excited. And I was like, let's see what's in the trunk. Can we open the trunk? So we go to the trunk and no, we could not open the trunk, which is very upsetting. But that's what I mean by the walls of the world. The creators did not build that far to the point where we could open this trunk. Another example is, you know, you're playing Grand Theft Auto and there's a door, but you can't open the door. That is you seeing the walls of the world. And when you're world building, you want to make it seamless. You want to hide these walls as best as you can. And the way that you do this is if you introduce something, you let your reader be able to explore it. So for example, and you know, this happens a lot more, I think, in YA high fantasy than it does epic fantasy. But that's just my personal opinion, what I've noticed. But I was reading this book a couple of weeks ago, and the main character, like a lot of main characters, really likes to read, loves books and all of these things. But we never hear anything about the books that this main character is reading. There's no color, what it's made of, what it looks like, who the author is, what the title is, what part of the world it's from. The only information that we get is, oh, this was a novel, or oh, this was a historical text. And every time I brush up against something like that while I'm reading, I just think, oh, there's the wall of the world. The author didn't build any more into this world, so I can't explore any of these things. And so if you're going to introduce something like that, if you're going to introduce, you know, books or any of these things, actually give it depth. And a lot of these things will be built in your world as you need them. You don't need all of this tidbit information before you start writing. But if you brush up against that, if you have a character in your world who likes to read and they're filing through books, tell us about the books. And I'm gonna give a couple more examples of this too. brand names and things are important, especially if your characters are trading something expensive for something else. If your character is purchasing or trading or drinking a certain wine, what part of your fictional world did that wine come from? What color is it? What does it taste like? History, backstory of that wine. You can have your own different varietals and things in your world. Same thing with candles or oil for lamps. These are the types of things that, especially in a medieval fantasy setting, people would need to buy frequently, and they usually buy from the same person. So you can tack on a brand name to that really expensive beeswax candle because beeswax is expensive. Or you could just call it a generic tallow candle, but even then, these things are going to be expensive, and there will be name brands and places that these things come from and people that your characters routinely buy these things from. So, like I said, if you introduce something into your world, make it seamless and actually add a little bit of depth. What does the money feel like in your character's hands when they're exchanging it? What does the material and the fabric feel like on their skin? Where do these things come from? And that's a big thing that I do in my world. When I'm creating my map, I always do major imports and exports for every country. That helps inform the agriculture and what the landscape looks like, but it also informs what things are common, what types of things are going to be expensive in that country, etc. So this brings us to the blueberry conundrum, which is a term of my own devising, which I'm very proud of. But it's basically this idea of how far do I push this world building to make it its own? Can I have blueberries in my secondary world? And if so, can I call them blueberries? And the answer is yes. If you have blueberries if you have berries in your second world and you have the color blue, you can call them blueberries. That's fine. But do some research into some of these things. Too often I come across like the word Ottoman or a Davenport in a fantasy world, and Davenport is a very Midwest term. It will not fit in your fantasy world. Ottoman is from the Ottoman Empire. There was never an Ottoman Empire in your fantasy world. Phrases too. Phrases are a big one. You can't call a cup of coffee a cup of Joe in your fantasy world because that was named after a guy named Joe from the U.S. military. And you don't turn modern day our phrases in your fantasy world. I was reading a fantasy book the other day where someone said, shut your mouth before I shut it for you. And that's very much a modern, I don't know if it's used anywhere else, but a modern American phrase. And it's so jarring to come across something like that. The expectation that I have when I'm going into reading a fantasy book is full immersion. So if your world building is super shallow, or if you're stealing these traits and these things from our world and just, throwing them into your fantasy world, a lot of your readers are going to pick up on that. And it's, it takes away from the immersion element. It's, as the reader, it's not giving me what I want. And more times than not, I will put one of those books down. Even if the story is relatively good, I can't finish it. And that could just be my snobbiness coming through. I don't know. But, put work into these things. So that's pretty much all I got for you guys today. It was more of a rant, I think, than advice, but oh well. A resource. I didn't really plan a resource for this week, but as I'm thinking about it, go play a video game. That's my resource. Go play a video game and actually attempt to look for these seams and the walls of the world that you're playing in. And it could be anything. It could be not being able to open a door or a trunk. It could be not being able to explore a certain area. It could be anything. Take some notes of these things, and if that was part of your fantasy world, how would you actually add depth to those things? All right, so I'll see you guys next time to talk about characters. But for now, you should be writing stuff.